Let's get started. And let's see, technical difficulties aside, here we go. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of tonight's talk about what you can expect. And I'm going to start by setting the stage and talking about who this talk is for. Well, I want to believe that this talk is for everyone. It's specifically designed for people that are beginner mushroom enthusiasts and want to get involved in mushroom identification. If you are still learning the various mushroom forms, this might be a little bit advanced. That's why there's the 201 designation. But if you're fairly comfortable with distinguishing a guild mushroom from a bolete, from a chanterelle, from a polypore, you're in the right place. And even for those that are not quite there yet, I think that there's still a lot for you here. And even for those that are more experienced identifiers, more than likely, this is not going to be a presentation where you're going to gain much in the way of new knowledge about mushroom identification, but perhaps you might learn some new or differing approaches to how to share your wealth of knowledge and experience with others and engage a broader audience. We will spend some time talking about proper documentation and collection of mushroom specimens from the field for identification. But the real focus of tonight's talk is going to be on the macromorphological characteristics of fleshy mushrooms. And Annie was kind enough to include in the announcement or invitation for tonight's talk a check sheet that I put together. If you've printed that out, excellent. If you haven't but have access to it, I encourage you to refer to that throughout tonight's talk. If you have no idea what I'm talking about right now, reach out to Ma and they can forward you that check sheet. It's something that I put together and it's by no means exhaustive and comprehensive. It's really meant to be a tool to help introduce you to the forms and terms that you're going to be seeing. If you haven't already opened up a mushroom identification book, there is a feast of information that's presented to you when you begin to endeavor into mushroom identification, whether you are just browsing a field guide or you're using a guide for identification purposes, trying to narrow down who it is that you have in front of you. And authors of field guides use varied approaches when it comes to species descriptions. I've tried to capture the most common and traditional forms of descriptions that most authors include in green on the right-hand side of your screen. Depending on the author and their experience and worldview, they could use very broad and familiar terms, while others might use more technical terminology. I don't have an axe to grind with either approach, other than the fact that if you are reading descriptions by different authors, particularly if you're new, this can come across as somewhat confusing or conflicting, when in fact they're describing the same thing, just using different words. So it's good advice to become familiar with or utilize different guides, simply because that will help expand your knowledge and language around fungal morphological identification. And I've been asked in the past, well, if I could focus on just a few of these things, what should I focus on? My advice is not to neglect any single one of them. If the author has taken the time to put them into their description, it's important. Certainly there are things that are variable and that you might want to put a little less stress or weight on, but that only comes with time and experience. So when you're starting, neglect any of these things at your own peril. And because this is a talk about the macromorphological, meaning the physical things that we can see, I will touch on other aspects that are not necessarily things that we can observe but are still important. And certainly it should be noted that if you really want to get into mushroom species identification, there's mushroom identification and then there's mushroom speciation. And these are related but rather two different fields of an approach to getting to know your mushrooms. When it comes to mushroom identification, you can rely heavily on the macromorphological, but when you want to get accurate level species identification, you're going to have to invest both time and money into some equipment and tech, not the least of which would be a microscope, and to a greater extent, I don't know many people, but clubs often have purchased PCR machines for amplifying DNA. I have yet to have met a club that actually owns a sequencer. Not only are they expensive, they're incredibly, just to purchase, they're incredibly expensive to maintain. So, but if you really want to know the mushroom that you have, that's kind of where things are going. But all this to say is that you can still get really far with the macromorphological. And if you are able to get to a point where you can say with confidence, I think it's any one of these, half a dozen possibilities, congratulations. That's a big deal and good for you. Don't be dissuaded because you don't have a microscope or you don't have access to a DNA sequence. There's still a lot that you can accomplish. And this is a big, broad field. There's room for everyone, for folks that just want to know what's safe to eat, all the way to the folks that want to write their own mushroom ID book one day. You should feel comfortable and that there's space for you at the table. And there probably, or there might be some folks out there thinking, well, can I just submit my my images to iNaturalist and iNaturalist is going to tell me what I have, or somebody on iNaturalist is going to tell me what I have. And let me just provide a word of caution. Well, first and foremost, I'm a huge fan of iNaturalist as a tool, as just as much as any field guide or peer-reviewed article is a tool to help you with your pursuit of mushroom identification. But it's really essential to note that the identifications made on iNaturalist, whether by the AI or by other members, in the community, are not always right. Like any community science project, IDs come from a broad spectrum of experience and expertise. Some people are incredibly knowledgeable, but there are others that are less so. And sometimes people exceed their abilities in offering or agreeing with IDs. And this is not to say that some species, not even to mention that some species just simply can't be identified based on macromorphological features alone. There's a responsibility that you have, that if you want to know what your mushroom is, you can certainly take what iNaturalist says, as well as the people within the community that's trying to offer their best knowledge and advice. But that doesn't mean that you should take it on faith, and ultimately it rests on you to perform due diligence and frankly just do the hard work and struggle like all the rest of us to figure out what it is that you actually have. So once you are prepared to go out and identify your first mushroom, let's talk about what you are actually going to do once you are out in the field. And you're going to begin probably not exactly where you might expect. And that's not really getting out there and documenting or collecting your mushroom specimens, but actually taking account of where the mushroom is growing and how it's growing. So you want to be sure to document what I'm calling the habit, habitat, and substrate, the ecology of the organism, without needing to acknowledge the the actual role that it's playing within the ecosystem. So the habit refers to how the mushroom is co-occurring with other members of its species, if in fact there are other members of its species present. The habitat, meaning the plant community, whether it's a forested ecosystem, a man-made landscape, an agricultural system, a sand dune environment, you name it. This is the sort of information that you need to acknowledge and document. And this can be done, of course, photographically. You can also make notes or recordings, but it's really important to document this information. You'll be surprised when you get back and you're trying to identify your mushroom, how much these sorts of details actually matter. And if you can, please be as specific as possible. If your knowledge doesn't extend beyond knowing a hardwood from a conifer, that's still better than nothing. But the more specific, the better. And you can use tools like field guides or iNaturalist to aid you in identifying the plants that the fungi are co-inhabiting the landscape with. And of course, the substrate. So what is the fungus growing in? And again, being as specific as possible is only going to help your situation, because some species, while being broadly generalist, can associate with a broad number of plants or substrates. There are others that are very species or substrate specific, and making sure that you have that information before you leave the habitat will definitely be to your advantage. So once you've taken an account and assessed the habitat and the environment in which the mushroom or mushrooms that you wish to study are occurring, the next step is to take a lot of pictures in situ. And by that, I mean, don't touch the mushroom, at least not yet. You want to document where it's occurring, how it's occurring before you touch it. And this is because until you really learn some of the typical characteristics of certain groups of fungi, there are fungi that respond very quickly to being handled or injured, and you want to capture the fungus in its purest, if you will, form before handling it. And I really encourage you to include some object for scale. A ruler is obviously the best, but anything that you might always have on hand. And for me, that will always be my mushroom knife. Now, you will be returning home and taking precise or accurate measurements, hopefully both, once you get home. But for the purposes of kind of giving a point of reference, particularly if you're going to submit your images to a source or to a platform like iNaturalist, having something with a scale in the background can be incredibly useful. And once you've kind of taken those in situ photos, then you can move to extracting the mushroom from its substrate. And it's very important to capture all aspects of the mushroom. So once you've removed it from its substrate, make sure that you get side and absolutely make sure you get pictures of the fertile surface known as the hymenium. So all features need to be visible, and you need to take a multitude of photos from a variety of angles, preferably in focus if at all possible. I can't claim that's always the case for me. Or if you're fortunate, and this is in the case of mushrooms that have single fruiting bodies or spore carps, but for those instances where there are multiple mushrooms being produced, you can take a single photo with multiple fruiting bodies arranged in a variety of angles and views, and what's known as a documentary style photograph. I would still recommend taking more up-close pictures of various features that you think are noteworthy. And it's important to note that you might miss some important characteristics if you only focus on taking pictures of the most pristine or what you think are the most ideal representation of the specimens. You really should take pictures of the forms as you see them in various ages and conditions, because all of that might make a difference in your identification. And if I say it once, I'm going to say it a dozen or more times tonight. The age of the mushroom and the conditions in which you are encountering that mushroom can dramatically affect the appearance of the specimens that you're bringing home for collection. This particular mushroom that I documented, I believe in the fall of last year, I was able to go back and observe it multiple times, or the fungi growing in this particular habitat. And you can see that after just 1 week, how dramatically the mushrooms had changed. So please be aware that what you're seeing is just really a snapshot in time. And you might not always have the ability to go back and observe your mushrooms in their natural habitat repeatedly, but if you do, you will likely see how that mushroom changes, which is a worthwhile endeavor, whether you're interested in identifying it or not. And I think that this is a good, I would like to take this opportunity to talk about your approach to mushroom collection, whether it's for identification purposes or for other purposes. And I would like to invite everybody to adopt an attitude and commitment to conservation and stewardship, and really focus on collecting only what you need, and to try and minimize as much as you can your disturbance of the site, and to recognize that we are not the only creatures out there that enjoy these fruits of the forest. In fact, there are many creatures out there that actually depend on mushrooms for food, for refuge, and as well as for breeding grounds. And this is not so much a point for folks that are out there studying mushrooms as much as it is for folks that harvest mushrooms for the table or for dye or for medicine. But I think it's really important to not really look at the forest like you would a grocery store and just walk in there and only ever take, but prepare to give back in any way that you can. And I encourage everybody to take a step back from our consumer-oriented approach to life and think about what you can do to be a caretaker for the fabulous world that surrounds us. But in the instance of collecting mushrooms for identification, it is important to realize that you really do need to collect the whole mushroom. You never want to cut the stem, and you really need to dig well below the base. If you don't do this, there's a lot of important information that you're likely to miss, including whether the mushroom that you are collecting has a deeply rooting taproot, whether it might be attached to some other organism, such as another mushroom like this truffle, or an insect. You might also miss that it is that at the base there are remnants of the universal veil attached. And for those that might be following along or using the fleshy mushroom check sheet, you can look on the very last page of that to see if you're not familiar with what a universal or partial veil is. And but also the shape and structure of the base of the site can be really important information too, as can other features such as basal mycelia that might display some coloration or some other features that can help you with your struggle towards getting to know your mushroom very well. So you've documented the environment, you have documented the mushroom in situ as well as in the field, and now you are coming home and you are taking care to protect it and bring it back. And once you get home, I cannot stress enough that freshness is really very key. The longer that you delay, the more likely it is that you're going to lose some valuable information. So be aware that ideally you'll have set aside some time to look at your mushroom and document its features before they begin to erode or decay. And if that's not possible, I would recommend storing the mushroom in a cool place, cool and dry, or if it needs to be more than a couple of hours, in the refrigerator. But again, you're likely going to lose some important information by doing that. So tonight, again, I'm going to be kind of riffing off of the handout that was included in the announcement, the fleshy terrestrial mushroom features check sheet, which is a bit of a mouthful. And again, there's certainly a lot more to be included in that particular, or there's no more space to include much more in that document. So what I really like to do is kind of elaborate on some areas that I think need some better detail, and talk about some things that are not included in the check sheet. And really, I'm going to, due to time and likely your attention span and ability to sit there for more than an hour, I'm going to focus just on the pileus or the cap, as well as the fertile surface, also known as the hymenium. And this is not an attempt to be dismissive of the important features of this stipe, but I am going to skip most of those, but keep in mind that at least a portion of the description that I'm going to, some of the descriptions that I'm going to apply to the surface of the pileus can also be applied to the surfaces of this stipe, though there are some understandably remarked differences. And before we move on to those features, I want to make a final note about spore prints. And this is in specific regard to your agaric or your guild mushrooms, that this can, not having a spore print can be a definite obstacle when you're trying to make your way through a key. It can also be valuable for your bolete forming fungi. And not only are they important, but they're also beautiful, and they can serve as a means for microscopic examination down the road. So you can archive these and hold on to them, and if you don't have a microscope, you can always come back to them later. I highly recommend that you check your spore prints every couple of hours to document the color. I have seen far too many times that particularly when I think back to my students that have forgotten their mushrooms on top of their papers. And if you don't keep an eye on them, you might be surprised and come back to a rather gross and disgusting, needless to say, often smelly mess. And I think it's worth noting too that you shouldn't be surprised that your mushroom might be carrying some unexpected passengers of the insect kind. And if this bugs you, you might want to take your measurements and characterize your mushroom and do your spore prints outside of the home, depending on the level of tolerance of both you and the beings that you might live with. So now I'd like to actually get into the meat of tonight's talk and start talking about some features of the pileus. Again, this is not intended to be exhaustive, but it is some of the lessons that I have learned from my students over the years with the things that they have, the terms and concepts that they have struggled with. And I owe a deep amount of gratitude to those individuals who have helped me not only become a better teacher, but I would like to think also a better mycologist by really forcing me to better understand and think about these organisms in a much more concrete and in many ways a much more profound way. So if there are any out there, I owe you a lot. Thank you. So one of the things that when I think about, my early endeavors to help students come to terms with mushroom identification was helping my students understand the difference between scales and warts, because when you see a drawing or a photograph, it's not necessarily evident or even intuitive what the difference is. And so the difference fundamentally is that one attribute or type of ornamentation is actually integrated or part of the cap cuticle or the skin of the cap, whereas the other is are remnants of a different feature entirely and can be rather easily removed. And the type of ornamentation that is integrated into the cap, and if you try to pick it off or pull it off, you'll be removing additional cap tissue, are known as scales. Warts, on the other hand, are remnants of a structure known as the universal veil. Again, if you have the check sheet, you can look on the last page. And these remnants can be easily wiped off. They are, some mushrooms grow encased in, as they develop and mature, are initially surrounded by a structure known as the universal veil. The structure can be of a variety of different materials, or the thickness of the material can vary. And in the next image, you can see that in some instances, depending on the structure of both the universal veil as well as the surface features of the cap, that sometimes the universal veil will not leave any remnants whatsoever, but will adhere solely to the base as a cup-like structure known as the vulva. But in other instances, the veil remnants can leave these speckles ranging in size from powder and grain all the way up to wart size, and even larger adhesions known as patches. So it really boils down to whether you can remove them, or whether or you can remove either one of them, but whether or not by removing them, you remove additional tissue. With warts, if you just rub your thumb over them, they easily come off, and it really doesn't do any damage to the cap by removing them. In equal measure, they can be removed by precipitation. So something that you would expect to have warts may not if you are collecting them after a heavy precipitation event. So just be mindful of that sometimes things that should be there are not always there. Another struggle that my students had was really understanding what the heck do you mean by a hairy cap? Because when you look at these two examples, both are hairy. They're different types of hairy. The image on the left-hand side has these dark hair-like or thread-like fibers that are kind of pressed or slicked down on the surface of the cap. They don't really change the texture or feel of the cap. whereas the cap on the right-hand side is clearly very fuzzy, dense, has a high density of fibers projecting off of the surface. And the first example of the fibrillose cap is not what we would typically call a hairy cap, despite there being hairs on it. Traditionally, hairy caps, or the term hairy, is reserved for caps that have projections emanating off the surface, hair-like, thread-like projections. And there are a multitude of different types of hairy caps, and they boil down to basically three characteristics: the length of the hairs, the density of the hairs, and the stiffness of the hairs. And every permutation has a different name associated with them. Some authors will be very precise and give you the sort of terminology that reflects all three of those characteristics. Other authors will just simply call it a hairy cap. Know that there are different types of hairy, but when we talk about hairy, we're talking about the right-hand example and not the left-hand example. And then there are patterns and textures that are great when they're evident, but these patterns and textures can become less pronounced over time. And if I said it once, it bears repeating that age and weather can change the appearance of these characteristics. And the developmental stage of the mushroom that you collected at can also dictate the pattern and the texture that you observe. So please keep in mind that while your identification manual might say that a mushroom cap is radially wrinkly or rugose and has a roughened surface with a scurfy, scaly-like sheen on top, that may be readily reflected in a very young specimen, but may be less apparent as the mushroom ages. And the same with zonation and color in general. These are features that, again, when they are there, are great and can be incredibly diagnostic, but when they're not, can lead to a lot of frustration on the part of the identifier, particularly if you really are counting on them or expecting them to be there. The next feature, or I guess set of features rather, I would like to talk about in the context of moisture or the lack thereof. And both, you might be surprised at how this sort of spins out, because moisture and the lack of is very relevant in both cases. One looks incredibly moist and juicy, the other one not so much, but moisture is equally important in both of these scenarios. But first, let's deal with the mushroom cap on the left-hand side. And in a general sense, that mushroom cap has a slimy cap. And slimy caps are variously described as glutinous or viscid, and I've heard these terms used interchangeably. They mean slightly different things, and I've heard different applications of these terms. So I want to kind of clarify what these terms really mean, also acknowledge how they're often used. But at the end of the day, we're talking about slimy cap mushrooms, no matter how you cut it. So technically, a viscid surface is a surface that has a thin layer of mucus, while a surface that's considered glutinous has a thick layer of mucus. How you determine what's thick and thin, that's a great question. It's above my pay grade. Maybe somebody else out there can answer it. And so it's a rather trivial distinction, but I've also heard folks use the term viscid to describe a surface that's tacky, that has like a glue-like surface texture. And regardless of whether the cap is actually glutinous or viscid, as that mushroom dries out, it can get a sort of tacky feel to it. And both the sliminess can be a really helpful and important diagnostic feature for both the cap as well as the stem. But this typically is only evident in relatively fresh specimens. So if this is useful and helpful, you are not necessarily going to come across the mushroom when that particular feature is evident. So the problem is that these mushrooms that have these glutinous or these slimy caps can frequently dry out rather quickly, and it makes it hard to tell whether or not the mushroom was once slimy. So is there a way to actually know whether or not the mushroom was once slimy? Well, I'm going to give you a clue, and you can tell me whether or not it actually works for you in practice. And if you take a look at the slimy cap mushroom on your left, you'll see that there's some debris that's attached to that, that glutinous layer. That glutinous layer is pretty adhesive, and if there's any small debris in the area, it's likely going to cling to it. So even as that mucus layer begins to dry out, that debris can remain detached. So if you find mushrooms that don't have a clear or obvious layer of slime on it, but there's a lot of material that is attached, and I mean pretty securely attached. You can't blow it off. You'd kind of have to pick it off with your fingernail. There's a good chance, not a perfect chance, but there's a good chance that the cap of your mushroom once had a slimy layer of mucus on it. Whether you want to call it a gluten or a viscid cap, I'll leave that up to you. On the other extreme, it looks like we have a situation where the cap is completely dried out, when in fact that's not the case, at least for this particular mushroom that has an areolate or cracked surface. And with mushrooms that have an areolate surface, it's a specific type of cracking that resembles dried mud or paint. But here's the thing. The cap surface of just about any mushroom can become cracked in dry weather conditions. But some species like this Xerocamelus develops cracks in its cap under normal ambient, not dry weather conditions. And in instances of fungi that have these sorts of caps, the color of the flesh between those cracks can be helpful in identifying the mushroom that you have. But as I mentioned, because any mushroom cap can become cracked under the right circumstances, I don't think it's a great idea to stress too heavily the level of crackedness, if that's an actual word, in your identification decisions. But it's important not to dismiss it entirely, particularly if conditions have not been notably dry. So remark on it, pay attention to it, but just be aware it might not be terribly important or relevant for your specific situation. And of course, reactions in general to injury, weathering, and age. Really, this speaks to both the loss and gain of color. So when mushrooms are injured by handling or by falling debris, or animals such as insects or rodents chewing on them, This can cause injury that results in bruising or staining, and these are certainly things worth noting and paying attention to, and speaks to why you want to take pictures of your mushrooms before you begin any handling, both so that you can see what they look like before you started messing around with them, as well as after. And then you might not think that the smaller image on the upper right-hand side is an image of all of the same mushroom, but it really shows how mushrooms that are hygrophanous, meaning that their tissues, most often their caps, that change color as they dry, how profound that can be. So in hygrophanous mushroom caps, generally the fresher mushrooms, the more newly emerged, are darker, often tend to be slightly translucent when wet, and become more and more opaque and paler as they dry out. And then there certainly are examples of mushrooms that have water-soluble pigments in their caps, and these mushrooms can readily leach out those pigments, particularly in humid as well as weather that is experiencing, or when the mushroom is experiencing a lot of precipitation. And also keep in mind that these caps are designed to protect the fertile layer where the spores are produced. So they're exposed to they bear the brunt of practically everything. The UV radiation, temperature changes, precipitation, wind, you name it, they're experiencing it. And so while as a visually oriented species, we tend to really focus on those visual characteristics, know that they are some of those that are most greatly impacted by the environment in which they reside. So a lot to take in and to think about as you consider your the mushrooms that you are finding. So be aware of the weather that's occurred prior to your collections, I think is a fair piece of advice. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about what I think is an underappreciated part of the mushroom, and that's the edge of the mushroom cap. This edge of the mushroom cap is referred to as the margin, and it can go through some pretty dramatic changes over the course of the mushroom's development. Perhaps not as dramatic as the cap surface, but this is a part of the mushroom that yields a lot of valuable information that we tend to overlook. And certainly as the mushroom goes through various developmental stages, the curvature of the margin can change rather dramatically, as we can see in this particular image. When the mushroom is just emerging and very young, it's very tightly enrolled. The margin is very tightly enrolled or involute. But as the mushroom cap expands and begins to mature, you can hopefully make out that the margin is no longer involute, but is now incurved, and probably in certain places is plain or straight. The shape of the margin is a feature that is often discussed, but not clearly so. It's usually thrown in with descriptions of the mushroom cap. Some authors pay more attention, others pay less. And of course, it's not always that important of a feature, depending on the particular mushroom. But it is worth noting and appreciating the wide variety and array of forms, of which I've just depicted a few in this particular slide. If for no other reason, take a moment and look at the margin, look at the edge of your mushroom cap, and recognize that it's very rarely as simple and as straightforward as you might initially perceive it to be. And though not inherently part of the margin of the cap, certainly associated with it, are structures that are known as partial veils. And partial veils are occur in certain groups of immature sporocarps of basidiomycete fungi. And this structure extends from the stem surface to the cap margin and shields the hymenium in the instances that I've represented here, either the gills or the pores, during their development, and releases as the mushroom cap expands, exposing the hymenium once the spores are mature and ready to be dispersed. The absence or presence of a partial veil, as well as its form and structure, is a valuable piece of information to have for your mushroom identification. Some mushrooms have both a universal and a partial veil. Others have only one or the other, and still others lack any type of veil whatsoever. Both of these types of veils can degrade and even disappear with age or due to weathering. And what I've depicted here are a few of the different types that you might encounter. And there's a variety of adjectives that are used to describe these types of veils. In addition, whether they are thick or thin or powdery can also be applied to partial veils as well. And when the partial veils detach from the margin, sometimes they can fall, remain attached to the ring, and form what's known as the annulus, also known as rings. And some mushrooms have partial veils that are so thin or filmy and delicate that they can disappear after they break away from the margin, and these are known as evanescent. And you will have to perhaps take my word for it that this is the remnants of a partial veil here from a glutinous veil that after a couple hours had completely disappeared. There are others yet that leave just a trace on the stem, and these are known as annular rings or ring zones. These are particularly prominent in mushrooms like the Cortinarius that has those fibrillose, cortina-like veils that remained attached as small fibers on the stem and can be missed, other than the fact that oftentimes the spores from the gills adhere to those fibers and form a distinct ring around the stem. Others form a more persistent-like structure and can hang down like a skirt or flare up and ascend. Sometimes those features can also adhere to the stem, so it's important to take a close look. And there are others yet that form that result as from a double layer of partial veil material, forming a double ring. And in this particular instance, the double ring is known as flowing because it can slide up and down the stem if you give it just a little bit of pressure. And there are instances where the partial veil doesn't actually adhere to the stipe, but sometimes it remains attached to the margin of the cap. And when this happens, we refer to this type of margin as being appendiculate. Just like there's a variety of types of hairies of cap surfaces, there's also a multitude of different types of hairy margins, just a few that I've depicted here. And another common type of margin feature to be aware of are lined or striate margins. And these sorts of margins have surfaces marked with parallel lines, which typically correspond to each gill on the underside of the pileus. In thinly fleshed species, like we see in the upper right-hand side of the slide, the gills are actually visible through the flesh, and these margins are termed as translucent striate. And if you were to rub your finger over the margin, they would feel smooth. There's no edges or grooves to be perceived. These lines or striations can also disappear if the mushroom cap dries out. In the more thickly fleshed species, the gills are not visible through the flesh, but reflect fine lines or ridges that you can actually feel by running your finger over the edge of the margin. These sorts of striations typically don't disappear entirely if the mushroom cap were to dry out, but can become more difficult to see as the mushroom cap expands. So I see that I haven't lost the majority of folks, so congratulations. You've made it through a fair amount of material tonight, but we're not quite there yet. So I do want to talk about some of the features of the hymeneum that I think are going to be particularly useful to you in your pursuits of mushroom identification. So if you can bear with me for just another 15 or so minutes, we're going to get through what I hope is some additional interesting information for you to consider. And then we'll spend some time actually applying what you have just learned, or we'll give it a shot anyways. One of the most useful things that I think you can do and get a lot of information is to do a longitudinal section of the mushrooms that you collect. Now, the timing of this is going to depend on how many specimens you have to evaluate, and whether or not you're actually bringing the specimen home for further evaluation or not. Hopefully you are, but if you're not, these longitudinal sections can occur in the field. But if you're if you only have a single or very few specimens of varying quality, you might want to bring them home and do the dissection there. And the information that you can get is quite important. Not only can you get what I think of is probably your best view for the attachment of the gills to the stipe, which can be very important distinguishing characteristic. You can get the pore attachment for boletes as well. You can get information about the interior contents and the flesh of both the stipe and the cap. You can determine whether or not the stipe is solid, whether it is stuffed with cottony material, whether it's hollow, and all of the permutations in between. You can determine what the color of the flesh of the mushroom is, both of the stipe as well as the cap, and remark on any changes that might occur as a result of that sort of injury, and whether those changes are instantaneous or whether or not they take some time to appear. So these longitudinal sections can tell you a lot more than just your gill attachment if you take the time to do them, and I strongly recommend that you do. I don't have a lot to say about gill spacing other than I think it's just as much an art form as it is a technical approach. I've read, I can't tell you how many different authors describe the gill spacing of the same mushroom and land on various conclusions as far as whether it's crowded, close, or distant. I think it's fairly obvious to know when you have a crowded when you have crowded gills versus remote gills. but I think there's a lot of interpretation when it comes to close and distant. So all this to say is that don't hang your hat on gill spacing. It can be a useful characteristic, particularly if what you have is clearly a very crowded gill spacing, and the authors pretty continuously describe it as being distantly spaced. But other than that, it is a feature that is often included, but I find some value, but not a lot. You might also, it's important to consider the thickness of the gills, and that can be something that is also a bit more difficult to wrap your head around until you get some more experience, but those are some additional features that authors might mention or describe. And of course, just like I've mentioned with the cap surfaces, responses to injury are something certainly to be noted with respect to the gill surfaces, particularly when it comes to your milk mushrooms, the members of genus Lactarius and Lactifluus. Not only is it important to note whether or not the mushroom is releasing a milky substance, but the amount that's being released, is it scant, moderate, or copious? What color is it? Does it change color? If it changes color, how long does it take to change that color? And does it that latex eventually end up staining the gills a different color? And though I've avoided talking about taste tonight, when it comes to milk mushrooms, I think that this is a safe, although perhaps not entirely pleasurable place to begin with tasting mushrooms. Until you become more experienced, I would, or working along somebody that is, I would avoid tasting mushrooms with this exception. And how I would recommend tasting it is putting a little bit of the milk on your finger, touching it that little bit to the tip of your tongue, and seeing how things turn out. Be prepared for a potential level of heat and spiciness that you would not expect from a little bit of mushroom fluid on the tip of your tongue. If that doesn't sound pleasurable to you, just be aware that it is often a diagnostic feature that's used with latex forming, or mushrooms that release a latex. So you might be disadvantaged, but understandable if you don't really want to go that route. And also whether or not the gills stain or bruise from you handling them, and kind of the brittleness or the flexibility or waxiness of the gills can also be a helpful feature to at least be aware of and consider documenting. Surprisingly, the edges or the margins of the gills can yield additional helpful and worthwhile information. You might not expect a story to be told by looking at the edges of the gills, but there's a lot of beauty to behold if you get up close with these aspects of the mushroom. Sometimes you might find that they are jagged or toothy, also known as serrate. They can be wavy or undulating, as well as smooth, and as well as a variety of other forms. Sometimes you'll find mushrooms that their edges are different colors than the face of the gills, and these are referred to as being marginate gills. And in other instances, you might see that the gills have this speckled or variegated or mottled appearance. And this is a result of the spores as they develop maturing at different rates. And so the darker areas on the gills are areas in which the spores are mature or maturing, and the lighter areas are areas where the spores have not yet matured. and this can be quite beautiful, and usually an easy mushroom to encounter. This occurs right in your front yard. And then, of course, there's always something else. There are, it's worth taking a look to see whether or not your mushroom has cross veins, these slight, these very small, delicate attachments connecting one gill to the next, as well as having short gills known as lamellae, can also be a helpful diagnostic feature. And not all gills run directly from in a single pattern from the stike to the margin. Some branch and fork, and this can be, again, a useful characteristic if you know to look at it. And as Mitch mentioned tonight, there are a group of mushrooms out there known as the inky caps that deliquesce, and not all of them do so in such an extravagant fashion as depicted here. But this is a product of the gills breaking down and turning into that inky, gooey mess. And because I did mention that it was not all about gilled mushrooms, we should give some attention to mushrooms that have pored hymenia. And when it comes to spacing in this context, we're talking about pores and the number that you can fit within a millimeter of on a ruler. And so you can have your finely pored boletes that have they can fit 3 or more within a single millimeter, moderately pored, which 1 to 2 can fit within a millimeter, and those that are rather large pored, which would take up more space in a millimeter. And you might be wondering, well, how would I actually figure that out? Well, there's a rather straightforward approach, and you can take a ruler with millimeter increments on it, place it on your poured surface. I recommend doing several passes of counting the number of pores over a 10 millimeter space and taking the average. You're much more likely to get an accurate assessment of the number of pores than if you were just to take a couple of different millimeter segments. It's not as accurate as doing it over a greater length. The shape and arrangement of the pores is also important when it comes to boletes, whether they are round, angular, or some other shape. And in other instances, whether you have pores on top of pores, and whether those pores are scattered about randomly or radially aligned, can also help narrow the possibilities. And just like with gilled mushrooms, there's always a little bit more to consider. The depths of the tubes, and this is both the absolute, the length of the tubes, but also relative to the amount of flesh in the cap, whether or not the pores produce exudates or guttation fluids. And when it comes to boletes, noting what areas bruise or stain, what color and how quickly is terribly important. And though there was not the time to talk about chemical tests, when it comes to boletes, chemical tests are pretty necessary, at least as far as using the guides that I'm familiar with to really get at accurate identifications. So be aware that that might be an additional thing that you might need to acquire or explore if you really care about identifying boletes. So we have covered a lot of information tonight, and I'd like to take the opportunity to reinforce what you've learned in a couple of different ways. Firstly, I'm going to give you a little bit of homework. Of course, I can't tell whether or not you're going to actually do this homework, but here's some best advice that I have for you. So a good advice to both build up your mycological lexicon and enhance your documentation skills is to, at some point, take a mushroom, that has already been identified and work your way through the species description. Of course, a fresh specimen is ideal, but don't let the lack of fresh specimen detour you from this. Images can do in a pinch. Doing this will not only help you to better understand what you're seeing and what you should be paying attention to, but it'll also help you to develop an appreciation for the variability that naturally occurs within and across populations of mushroom-producing fungi. But for this moment, I have a different exercise in mind and thought we'd get to work on applying some of this newly acquired and hard-earned knowledge that you just gained. So what I would like to do is share with you an image, and I would like you to, in the chat, share what you see. And before some of you jump in there and start talking about what's wrong with this picture or what you don't see, we'll get to that. But let's take a moment to actually talk about and apply what you've learned. So let me first of all bring up the chat so that I can see it. And I'm hoping that I can see it. Let's see. It's not letting me. Well, perhaps this is not going to work the way that I anticipated.
I could read what people are saying for you if you want.
That would help, because I thought I would actually be able to see it, and it's not working for me.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. Do you want me to just read out what people are saying, or?
Yeah, well, we won't spend a lot of time doing that. But if folks want to share what they're seeing about the cap, let's start there.
Okay, so someone said smooth, dry cap.
Awesome.
Someone said wavy margin.
I like it.
Let's see. Those are the someone said convex cap with no ornamentation.
Beautiful. I love it.
Let's see. I'm just trying to get the things that are just about the cap. So those are the cap things people said. I guess for the cap, I would also say it looks like there's almost like a sterile margin kind of. It looks like there's a yellow line around the edge of the cap.
Yeah, I would agree. In this particular specimen, there definitely is. What about the hymenium? What are folks saying about that?
So someone, Elizabeth said the pores look very small. Someone said pores rather than gills, yellow color. Someone said blue bruising. Let's see. We got
very astute. I like everything that I hear so far.
Yeah, those are the things that people have said about the pore surface.
And what about the stipe?
Let's see. So people said two-tone stipe. That was, yep. Oh yeah. This is sort of kind of about the stipe and the cap. David McShane pointed out that the width of the cap is similar to the length of the stipe.
Very good.
Let's see. Old bug damage on the stipe is red. Stipe is bruising. Blue.
Appears to be. So you guys have hit on kind of all of the what I would say are some of the really key characteristics based on, you know, the image and the quality of the image that you're seeing. What do you wish you had? What isn't there that you think is lacking that would be helpful based on what we've just discussed tonight? So what's missing?
A lateral section, somebody said.
I couldn't agree more. Anything else?
Someone else said size. So I think probably meaning there's nothing to tell you the relative size.
Very astute observation. I couldn't agree more.
Various life stages seem to be missing. Someone else said. And
yep, I agree. It's that is always going to be a challenge. We kind of have to work with the materials that we have. But yes, ideally we would have different stages. And I would say there's probably some, older and younger here, but not obviously so.
Someone also said the broader environment is missing. So I guess, and somebody else said the spore proof. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree. You all have done an excellent job kind of cluing in on, while this does an okay job at capturing a good amount of the characteristics, it certainly could be a lot better, right? And so if we take a look at these additional images, I think addressing much of what members of the audience mentioned, both something in the background for scale, the greater environment. It might be difficult to see, but those mushrooms were sampled right at the base of this oak tree, which still doesn't speak to the larger plant community, but it was collected in a mixed hardwood forest with a lot of different species, but in this instance growing next to oak. There's in the field, it's almost impossible to collect a spore print unless you have an older specimen that's growing on top of another cap, and then sometimes you can collect a spore print, but having a spore print included in the images would certainly be very helpful. And we have the lateral section that's present that shows that that the interior is blue, and we get a little bit more of a close-up of the pore surface, and we can see that when I cut it, it also turned blue. I have some images that include some chemical staining, which, as I mentioned, can be important for boletes. But I think it's, while I agree that all of this information is helpful, there's some information that's still missing that really can't be included in photographs. And this is where those detailed notes become really important. So it's clear that this, not just the pore surface, but really every surface that I touched stained blue, and it stained blue immediately. That doesn't necessarily come through in an image, how quickly a mushroom turns color, whether or not it has an odor, what sort of odor it has. And when it comes to taste, if it's a relevant characteristic for the mushroom, what does it taste like? And that can be highly variable depending on the person doing the tasting. And when I look at this, I also look at it with a critical eye and going, you know what? I really wish I would have gotten some better, more up close pictures of the pore surface. I wish I would have gotten better pictures of the stipe, some more up close pictures of the cap. This was not a collection that I made to bring back into study, but still, I wish that I had captured those things more effectively than what I did. And so these can also be lessons for you when you go out there and you're learning. Don't beat yourself up too much. There's always room to grow and improve, and learn from your mistakes. And sometimes you don't know what you need to know until after the fact. But I promise you that with every attempt, you will get better. And it's a delightful process. And I hope that this encourages everyone to be an active participant and get out there and identify some mushrooms. So I really want to thank you all for hanging tough with me, and I'm happy to take any questions. So thank you very much, and I'll turn things back over to Annie.
Oh, that was awesome. Thank you so much. And I love the getting to put our kind of learning into action. That was just terrific. Tour de force, I would say. And honestly, like, I mean, I think of myself as like intermediate, and I feel like there was a lot that I learned from that, including some new words that I have to write down because there were some really good terms in there. Okay, so
Thank you, Annie. I appreciate that. I do not consider you intermediate in the least. You
uh,
are an inspiration, my friend.
I don't know about that, but I seriously, I mean, like, I just feel like if anyone thinks that they don't have a lot to learn about mushroom identification, then like that person is like,
Clueless.
that's like a red flag to me. It's like thinking you don't
Indeed.
have a lot to learn. Yeah, that was just terrific, and you're getting lots of kudos. So sweetie, quiet. My son is trying to say something about mushrooms. But I want to go through because we have definitely some questions in here. So let me start from the bottom. And so let's see. Well, many, that was excellence, engaging. Here's a question. What kind of knife brush do you have there in your picture? That was a question.
I don't know the name of it, but I received it as a gift from a dear colleague when I got tenure, and um, and while I might leave a lot of things in the forest, I have left it in the forest. Let me backtrack. I have left it in the forest, but I have always managed to get it back. Either somebody's generosity has brought it back to me, or I've been able to backtrack and find it, but I don't know the name of it. I'm sure that you can find similar ones on various online platforms. I know that they're kind of I would probably suspect that back in the day that was a pretty moderately priced knife, but there's the kind of the high end, the Opinel from France, and they're about $30 a piece. And you can find those online as well, both directly from the manufacturer and through other vendors. A worthwhile piece of equipment, let me tell you, not terribly sharp, but you don't need them to be terribly sharp when you're digging around and extracting mushrooms.
Totally. It's funny because one of the Noah Siegel, I don't know if you saw his talk that he did earlier, he loses so many knives in the woods that he carries around like disposable blades, like X-Acto blades, which
Yep.
is funny. I think people assume that he'll have like a very fancy knife, but it's like
nope, just about anything will do, and it doesn't have to be expensive, particularly if you have the tendency to leave stuff behind.
But I think the knife looks great for also because you know exactly how long your knife is. I mean, that's huge. Like, I think it gives you kind of a great built-in ruler. Okay, so
and you can stick it in the ground.
yeah. So another question that came up a couple times was, can you address the concerns about tasting and spitting mushrooms without ingestion?
Sure, and I would open this up to feedback from the leadership within the club as well. My perspective is, because I've heard presentations where folks say you can taste any mushroom you want as long as you spit it out. That makes me a little nervous. Because there are mushrooms that are deadly poisonous. I don't know what evidence exists about sticking them in your mouth and spitting them back out, but I'm going to err on the side of caution. And until you can distinguish between groups of mushrooms confidently, most notably the Amanita, the members of the genus Amanita, I would suggest avoiding that. And not only avoiding it from the perspective of the potential, even if it's low potential of toxicity, but also taste isn't relevant for all mushrooms. Taste is not used as a valuable or necessary feature for a lot of different mushrooms. And so once you understand whether or not taste is important, you can, I think, be more discerning about whether or not that's something to engage in. With the latex, as I'm trying to recall if I've ever tasted a gross, like a yucky latex. Like I've tasted like latex that will burn the hairs out of your nose, but I have never tasted something that I found gross. I'm sure it exists. It's just not been my experience. So I would say that small amounts of latex are safe. Many latex forming mushrooms are also edible. And so I feel, as far as when I'm directing people that are new to eating as well as identifying mushrooms, that's a safe space to introduce people to the idea of tasting wild things without potential lethal consequences. And I don't know if other members of the club have their own particular views, whether they differ from mine or not. I don't think that's the important piece. I think it's a great conversation to have.
I think that's a great explanation. And oh yeah, okay. So one person asked, will this be posted, the recording be posted? And yes, it will be posted on our YouTube channel. And we are a little behind with getting those up, but we are going to get them up. So we'll definitely make sure that we have, it'll be great. Then we'll have our mushrooms 101, our mushrooms 201. We can almost compile, we should have our own Coursera mushroom course. Yeah, so we'll definitely have that. Let's see. Does anyone else want to jump in with a question? I mean, at this point, if you don't feel like typing in the chat, you just turn on your camera if you want.
So one of the conversations that happened in the chat early on in Shannon's talk was about sort of what are the ethics of picking, and I feel like it fell into two categories of, number one, is there evidence of whether mushroom foragers are successful at scattering spores, or are the spores already so scattered that we are negligible? And number two, how much damage do you do picking mushrooms? How much is that likely to cut into the reproduction and sort of overall population health of a fungus?
I think that those are not only really good questions, but really important questions. The first one, I don't think that there's much in the way of evidence to suggest that our activities really help with the spore dispersal aspect of things. I don't think that it impedes it, but I don't know that it necessarily helps it. So the idea that, carry out your mushrooms in a perforated or some sort of mesh bag so that the spores, as you're walking out of the forest, trail out behind you. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I just don't, my understanding is there's not any evidence to support that helps one way or the other, but it likely doesn't hurt. The other question, or the other point, is that we simply don't know. This is an area that I'm very interested in and been doing literature searches. And this is a very difficult subject matter to address in a scientific way. And but I will pose a question back to the group, and that's, if you significantly reduce the reproductive fitness of any organism, can you claim that you do no harm? And we don't know the impacts that our actions are having. And I'm particularly concerned. I participate and I enjoy going to these big mushroom forays where, lots of people go out into the forest and collect mushrooms. I'm both curious as well as concerned as to the long-term impacts that has on the organisms producing those fruiting bodies. I'm not comfortable making a position because the evidence and the research has yet to be conducted. But I think it's definitely worth considering, and it being a bigger conversation than what it is within mushroom clubs, and how we can mitigate those practices. For any of us that spend time organizing or spending time at the ID table, the amount of mushrooms that get chucked at the end of the of a foray that don't even go through the process of being identified simply because it's so overwhelming. There's so much material that comes in for the limited number of identifiers. Really, I think speaks to a lack of discussion around how to approach the foray process and how to remain inclusive so people can participate, but not necessarily gather every single mushroom that they come across. And how does that happen? I don't know. But we have to have those sorts of conversations and begin dealing with our actions, I think, in a much more concrete way than I believe has ever occurred.
I love that answer because I think it, I think it's a sort of non-judgmental answer, but also an answer that comes with curiosity and also that comes with, I think, wanting to bring some intentionality or like mindfulness to this process where you can kind of get very carried away. And I love the idea of just being thoughtful and intentional about how we walk into the woods and walk out of the woods. I think that's like it may sound small, but I think that's a big start, is to actually talk about it and think about it.
I couldn't agree more, Annie.
Yeah,
I think we need to have more of these conversations and approach things intentionally and mindfully, and not necessarily with malintent. I certainly am not suggesting that, but with more care and thoughtfulness than perhaps we have in the past.
actually, it makes me think of something, and I don't want to call out David McShane, but David, weren't you telling me about how many different bugs or something like that were living on? I don't know. Sorry, David, if you're not
No,
able to.
totally.
Can you speak to that for a second, because my head was going there. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is based on a study that started in Russia, and I've been starting to replicate at a really basic level, where they went out and they bagged a whole bunch of Grifola frondosa, and they identified and counted all of the different bugs that lived in it. And it was over 200 species of different bugs that live in them. So my interest here is kind of cool, because a group of the bugs that they identified in them were Staphylinidae. These are generalist predator beetles that are really cool. They're very high on the food chain as far as bugs go. So they're out there eating a whole bunch of weird things that you might not necessarily want and that don't have a lot of natural predators, like invasive insects and things like that. These are in the groups that are being studied. There's nothing conclusive or anything like that. But what we do know is that they're obligates. They have to live in these Grifola frondosa. It's where they live and reproduce. And that then they are the ones going out and maybe helping to fight off the nasty things that you don't want in your garden, like these Arion subrufusca slugs, some of our invasive bugs that are causing problems, stuff like that. It's pretty cool.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I can try to find, maybe if you want to share it, or I can try to find that article, but I think like
I can send you the paper.
That would be great. And I can share, I'm happy to share it with the group. I think, it's just, I think we often see the tip of the iceberg, and so I don't know. I really like the way that Shannon spoke about that. Anyone else want to jump in with a question? Or Megan, not Megan, Elizabeth, were there other things that I missed from the beginning of the chat? I tried to scroll up, but
I think that was the meaty one.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I guess we can stop because we're pretty much over our time, but this was awesome. Thank you so much, Shannon. And one thing it's making me think is, like, we do a lot of walking in the woods, looking at things, but we don't really have as a club kind of an activity where we sit down and try to write about what we saw together. Like, that's a pretty lonely, solitary pursuit, I guess, like that. and it's hard I think it can be hard to hold yourself to a high standard, which I think, you kind of showed us today, how we can like really approach this with a high standard and be very thorough, and probably have a lot more luck getting through a key, or at least kind of getting help from other people if we can't get through the key, if we know what to tell them. So it's just making me think, like, should we have some way, and I don't know if you've encountered this, Shannon, maybe in the classes that you teach, where as a group, people are doing this kind of writing either together or sharing their results?
Absolutely. Well, with mushroom identification, I always approached it from an apprenticeship sort of standpoint. It wasn't, you make your collection, you do your best to figure out what it is, turn it into me, I'm going to grade it, and you'll get it back and not really understand why something is or isn't. We would work, it's very labor intensive. We would work side by side. It's also very intimidating for students to work next to their professor and have to account for why they're saying something that they're saying. But, you know, that is an obstacle that's overcome with fairly quickly. And it really becomes more of a partnership. But what I can envision is either a mentorship program, which again is an equally labor intensive process and puts the burden on relatively few people. But you can also make it more of a club-wide activity where you have either panels of people of all different knowledge levels and capabilities that can help people walk through, meet them where they are at and help them process what they're learning. Forays are a natural place for that to occur because that's where mushrooms are being collected. There tends to be resources present, and people can also walk away with some information, hopefully as well as a mushroom or two, and go home and pursue those activities a bit more intensively. But that's to me are some approaches that clubs can actually make that I think shares the burden and doesn't put it on just the few key identifiers, even though they can certainly be participants, but they are not the sole folks just, you know, always shouldering the work.
I think that's a great idea. And I think that's something we should really think about. You know, not that every foray would have that, but like whether we want to have, you know, intermittent events where we like people who really want to nerd out and, you know, like get in the weeds. You know, I know not everyone wants to do that, but I think it can be really fun. And I would love to do that with other people. So
Sequinota, I can think of as being kind of the ideal location, particularly evening, you know, over a couple of beers or whatever, and just sitting around and talking about mushrooms and removing that intimidation factor, particularly for folks that it might be their first or second time at a foray event and they don't feel that they have a place, or they feel like they don't know enough and they don't want to show their lack of knowledge and be vulnerable. But if they're surrounded by people of various knowledge, skills, and abilities, and everybody understands that it's okay not to be in the Premier League, that the B League is a pretty sweet place to be as well, that I think that can foster the sort of both individual growth and growth within the club that I think you're talking about.
that's very inspiring. So I think we should definitely do it. At least at Sequinota, we can give it a try. Be fun. Okay, well, thank you again, Shannon. This was like everything that I wanted to be and more. So thank you all so much.
I'm so pleased.
Yeah, and I think judging from the responses, I think folks got a lot out of it. So, and I know that people will be absolutely consulting the video when it's available, and you know, we have the sheets, and you know, we will carry this forward. So thank you again, and we insist that you come back. Okay,
I would love to. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, see you all at the culinary event, hopefully. Okay, bye.